Risk. What is it? How do you identify it? How do you control it? What level of risk are you willing to accept? When we decide to fly, we are accepting risk. The same is true for driving a car, taking a bus, riding a bicycle, or walking across a busy street. Much of what we do involves risk. Hazards are present in our daily lives, and with them are inherent risks. Am I making a wise decision? We all have a little voice inside our head that may tell us, that doesn't look right, or that asks us, is this action that I'm about to undertake safe? In some cases, the voice may inform us, this is a very stupid thing to do. In life, we usually have the correct answer stored in our memory, which will lead us to the safest course of action. However, when we are subject to the dynamic and complex environment of aviation, the little voice inside our head may need some assistance. By relying on regulations, training, and being current in our skills, we are given the much-needed guidance in answering the question, is this a wise decision? At times, the risk is such that avoiding it may be the only right way of dealing with it. But we cannot always decide simply to stay on the ground or to leave the car in the garage. Living requires that we manage risk by learning to make good decisions. What is risk? By definition, risk is the combination of a specific hazard and the likelihood that it will occur. Risk can be measured by the likelihood or probability, multiplied by how often the hazard is encountered. The severity or consequences of the risk allows you to assess its level. For example, aircraft accidents can be expressed by 1 accident per million flights and can be quantified through loss of life or financial loss. If we perceive something to be scary, painful, or unknown, it should be avoided at all costs. This is the notion of self-preservation. For most of us, putting ourselves into harm's way goes against our instinct for self-preservation and therefore constitutes an unnecessary risk.
Okay, now it's time to try some spins.
Geez, I don't know. Are these really necessary?
No, but it's safe to do when you practice them properly, and they're really good experience for you.
Well, I'm really not that confident about doing it.
Okay, as we enter the stall, I need you to add full right rudder.
Hey, that wasn't so bad after all.
The flight instructor demonstrated to the student pilot that while spins are something to be avoided at all costs, spin recovery is an important skill for students to possess and helps them to gauge when a spin would become a necessary risk.
Full right rudder.
Spin recovery is well within the instructor's comfort level or their personal risk parameters. The student, having never tried a spin recovery, is operating outside of his comfort level and looks at this particular lesson as an unnecessary risk. Upon recovery from the spin, the student realizes that he now has the ability to recover the aircraft. The risk manager, or in this case the instructor, sees that the student is better prepared in the event that this should happen in the future. However, the instructor points out to the student how much altitude is lost during the recovery and informs the student of the risk of performing the maneuver at too low an altitude. While in training, a student pilot's risk is managed by lesson plans and the supervision of the instructor. Once the student becomes a licensed pilot, they are not as constrained and are likely to encounter more risks in flight. They may encounter weather that they've never experienced. they may fly more advanced aircraft, and they may undertake more complex trips that are longer in duration and require flying over unfamiliar terrain. Eventually, they will gain experience, but early on, new pilots may not even recognize some of the hazards. They will not have acquired the rule-based behavior patterns of a more experienced pilot. The student's lack of experience results in an inability to deal with high-risk situations. In the decision-making process, assessment of risk is an assessment of probability. For example, given the deteriorating weather, what is the probability that it will get worse, get better, or stay the same? Obtaining more information through contacting a flight service station can help a pilot refine their estimate of what will happen, but it still amounts to the ability to gauge probability. The same assessment is made when you contemplate a particular action. If I do A, what is the likelihood that B will happen, or could C or D happen? How well you estimate the odds depends on many things. In fact, all the same factors that influence pilot decision-making also influence one's ability to predict possible outcomes. Flying is a continuous process of decision-making. It involves the pilot, the aircraft, and the environment in which the flight is taking place. Most decisions we make are based on short-term and long-term memories. Short-term memories are based on what we see and hear on a daily basis and are quickly lost. If information needs to be accessed time and again, it will more likely be stored into long-term memory, and this is typically accomplished through repetition or training. Additionally, maintaining currency in the aircraft affects long-term memory and should be an important consideration. For example, a pilot and a passenger are flying towards a thunderstorm. The pilot notes that the storm is nearly 5 miles away and decides to press on. The passenger, upon hearing this information, becomes uncomfortable with that decision and wonders if they should turn back. Both individuals are in the same situation, yet the pilot decides that it is safe, determining it a low-risk situation. How is it that they view the level of risk so differently? Because both are drawing from past experiences stored in their long and short-term memories. The pilot has been in this situation before and knows it to be safe and low risk. The passenger may be remembering some thunderstorms he experienced on the ground and found it to be a not too pleasant experience and relates it to the current flight situation. Their perception of risk is different, and they must communicate this to one another openly to aid the passenger in feeling more at ease. There are 4 primary factors that can reduce the probability of risk. They are awareness, attitude, supervision, and training. Where have you been? Where are you now? And where are you going? If you can answer these 3 questions before taking action, in flight and in life, you will most likely be able to avoid a major disaster. Awareness is achieved by pilots becoming more cognizant of their surroundings. Forward thinking and planning are required to have an understanding of risk and the liabilities associated with flying. A pilot's attitude has a direct correlation to the level of risk that they're willing to accept. A pilot's reputation, crew and passenger expectations, disciplinary issues, job security, and ego can be a part of the equation of a pilot's attitude toward decision-making and their level of risk acceptance. Supervision acts as a control to minimize risk. This can be as simple as a manager ensuring that approved cockpit procedures are being followed. However, with privately owned aircraft, the pilot is the supervisor and manager. They provide their own oversight. While following all the rules and regulations can help a pilot self-assess, It must be realized that they are the ones responsible for policing their own personal, physiological, and psychological state to ensure that they are not the major risk to having a safe flight. Just because you may not be a professional pilot does not mean you should not try to fly like one. Obtain as many certifications and gain as much training as possible. With more training, you are more likely to conduct a more accurate risk assessment of yourself and your environment. A professional approach is a risk reducer. Every flight requires forethought and planning, placing further emphasis on the importance of flight preparation. To reduce or minimize the negative consequences of an event is where the concept of risk management comes into play. In general aviation, this term is frequently used in the context of making decisions about how to best handle situations that affect the safety of flight. Risk management is the process of identifying hazards, assessing risks, making a decision, implementing the decision, and monitoring the results. Being able to manage risk effectively reflects a decision in good management. Risk management is the ability to identify and control risks according to a set of preconceived parameters. But who sets these parameters, and why are they important? Parameters can be set from a variety of sources, such as the FAA, the organization, management, the flight crew, the pilot in command, or PIC, as well as others. It is predominantly the PIC that is responsible for setting the risk parameters and is the key component for preventing accidents. One primary objective of this training is to assist pilots in being able to recognize the risk associated with their aviation operation and how to set their own personal risk parameters. It's true that what one pilot would consider to be an unacceptable risk would be different for another pilot who has the past experience, knowledge, and skill for that situation. Much can be gained by simply listening and observing others and how they relate to risk every day, experiencing common situations in an aviation environment. History has repeatedly demonstrated the importance of having all crew members share the same perception of risk. This is a key step in risk management. Consult and involve the people who will be affected by the decision-making process. Having everyone on the same sheet of music gives everyone a common frame of reference. This is of vital importance in the aviation environment where there is so much to lose. The GAR model is a common risk management tool. The green, amber, and red, representing GAR, helps determine different levels of risk. This model is commonly used by the U.S. Coast Guard in high-risk operations of search and rescue. The Coast Guard has identified 6 elements that affect the potential level of risk. They are supervision, planning, crew selection, crew fitness, the environment, and flight complexity. While this model is a viable tool in risk assessment and management, the true importance is that it creates a shared understanding of the potential risk. Additionally, open communication allows for exploring ways that risk can be managed. Even if you don't have a risk management tool, such as the GAR model, you can use the 6 levels of risk management to help evaluate your flight during the preparation phase. With supervision, consider the type, quality, and quantity of the organization and crew supervision, the means of cross-checking and monitoring of information. If you are a private pilot, you are the supervisor. Have you established standard operating procedures and guidelines? Do you have an effective checklist for your operation? These procedures will help aid in accountability when it comes to assessing risk. When considering planning, do you make time available for the amount of preparation needed for the flight? Is the important information current and available? Spending time in pre-flight planning will help one to counter risk. If you are planning a trip that risks you flying at night when you are not qualified to do so, try planning backwards from the goal. For instance,
if I want to arrive at my destination before dark, I will have to depart before 4 p.m. If I'm not airborne before this time, I will not take off, or I'll plan to only travel part of the way.
Pilots should view a flight plan as an event organizer that has identifiable areas of risk. All risks should be taken into consideration. For example, a pilot planning a cross-country flight might notice several likely areas of traffic, uncontrolled airports, airway intersections, and training areas. They should either plan to fly around these areas or become extra vigilant when encountering such risks. A good rule of thumb might be, if I'm not sure what to do, I will act in the safest way possible. Here, the intentions are good, but an inexperienced pilot might not be able to identify the safest action. Critical decisions about the aircraft must be made on the ground during pre-flight planning. Such decisions involve having enough fuel for the planned flight, weight and balance, takeoff and landing performance, crosswind limits, and cruise performance. Pilots conduct a walk-around for themselves to assess the condition of the aircraft. Aircraft assessments must continue throughout the flight with the monitoring of temperatures, pressures, fuel consumption, vacuum pressure, as well as other components. Who is the crew that was selected for this flight? Who was the pilot in command? Who was on this flight? How much flying experience do they have? And what is the currency level of the crew? If there is a new automation or equipment on board, what is the experience level with these new systems? Risk assessment does not mean that you do not launch the flight, but it does let you evaluate and make a good assessment of your assets and liabilities. Begin with pre-flighting yourself. When practicing good risk management every time you fly, make a point of pre-flighting the aircraft to check whether it is airworthy. But why stop at the aircraft? A pilot's well-being has its own associated risks, and the pilot's airworthiness may not be up to par. Good risk management, in fact, demands that pilots extend their pre-flight checklist to include themselves. Before any flight, pilots need to consider a number of factors: whether they are competent to fly, whether they are unhealthy or fatigued or taking medication, whether they lack flying time from the past several months, which could affect their sharpness and their ability to respond, and if they have an accurate assessment of their own personal stress level. At the very least, a pre-flight self-check may serve to alert a pilot that he or she is not likely to perform at their peak level. The I'm Safe checklist summarizes the most important factors that can affect a pilot's ability to perform well. I'm Safe takes into account illness, medication, stress, alcohol, fatigue, and emotion. Make this short checklist a part of your normal pre-flight check. If you answer yes to any of the questions, consider re-evaluating your decision to fly. Environment is an important subject area to be considered when assessing risk. The most obvious environmental concern is weather, especially given its high incidence of involvement in fatal general aviation accidents. But weather is not the only environmental concern. One should also consider the type of terrain to be encountered during the flight. Will you be over water or in mountainous terrain? Pilots must be aware of the potential risk when they select airports they might use during a flight. Runway length, width, surface, obstacles, and landing aids can all be seen as components of the environment in which the pilot and aircraft will operate. The interaction of the pilot, aircraft, and environment are influenced by the purpose and complexity of each flight. For example, a pilot on a military mission might assess risk differently than a pilot out for a Sunday afternoon pleasure flight. Is this a simple local flight around the pattern? Is it an overnight cross-country flight into unknown territory? Will it include night flying? Depending on the complexity of the mission and the crew's experience, more time may be required to assess the 5 specific processes of risk management just discussed. By using the 6 levels of risk to assess your flight, you will minimize the threat of risk. There are many risk assessment tools available, and each pilot should use the one they feel best fits their operation. Whatever tool you use, you must remember that when assessing risk, pilots must look at the circumstances affecting the 4 risk elements: pilot, aircraft, environment, and operations mission. Pilots must acknowledge that the situation can become a risk element in itself. The most important rule of risk management may be this: always leave yourself an out or wiggle room. Leave some time into your flight plan for the unexpected. This will give you some time to make a better decision. For example, if you are approaching bad weather, make sure it isn't closing in behind you. If you're on a final approach, don't let your airspeed get too low. Sometimes the regulations prescribe an out, such as the requirement for fuel reserve on a cross-country flight, or the restrictions on over-water flights by single-engine aircraft. Take a long look at your assets and your liabilities, and always do some what-if planning for each and every flight. You may opt to fly today, but by adjusting or changing your profile, you can improve the risk factors to work in your favor. In this training, we showed you the factors of risk that can influence a pilot's decision-making ability. We have defined risk and how it can be measured. This training has demonstrated a variety of countermeasures and risk management techniques that can help you in making better decisions. The Civil Aerospace Medical Institute has developed a video series for operational human factors. Subjects such as situational awareness and crew resource management are among some of the modules available for viewing. For more information, visit FAA.gov and type the keywords Airman Education in the search box.